In the darkest days of the war, German leaders laughed at Allied air warnings. They believed weather was their shield. They were wrong. Fatally wrong, because they never imagined a device that could see through the clouds. How do you hit a target you can't see? In 1942, Allied bombers were failing, but a secret British invention, H2S radar, changed everything in Europe. And that same secret would soon be used to guide the B-29s right over the heart of Tokyo. The Germans ridiculed Allied bombing. They called it clumsy, inaccurate, and they were right. That is, until a small spinning magnet in a British lab gave bombers eyes. This is the story of the radar that defined the air war. How do you hit a target you can't see? In 1942, Allied bombers were failing, but a secret British invention, H2S radar, changed everything in Europe. And that same secret would soon be used to guide the B-29s right over the heart of Tokyo. This is a story about confidence, the fatal, arrogant confidence of an enemy who believed they were safe, and the desperate, driven confidence of the Allied engineers who proved them wrong. It's a story that begins not in Tokyo, but years earlier, in the freezing, cloud-covered skies of nighttime Germany. Before the war, the great air power theorists, men like WWII and Attali, Trenchard and Gritton, and our own Billy Mitchell, had sold the world a powerful and terrifying idea. They preached the doctrine of the bomber mafia. The bomber, they declared, will always get through. They promised a new kind of war, one that would be over in weeks, not years. It wouldn't be the bloody stalemate of the First World War stuck in the mud of Flanders. No, this would be a surgical war. Fleets of great silver bombers would fly untouched, high above the battlefield, and strike with pinpoint accuracy. They would destroy the enemy's vital organs, their ball-bearing factories, their oil refineries, their power plants. The enemy's war machine would grind to a halt, and their will to fight would collapse. It was a clean, modern, almost technological dream. But in 1940 and 1941, that dream collided with a brutal and very cloudy reality. The Royal Air Force, the RAF, tried that doctrine. They sent their bombers over Germany in broad daylight, and they were slaughtered. The German Luftwaffe, with its fast, deadly Messerschmitt 109 fighters, tore them from the sky. The losses were catastrophic, unsustainable. So the British were forced to make a grim choice. They would abandon daylight bombing and fly under the protection of darkness. This, however, created a new and equally impossible problem. If it was hard to find a factory in daylight, it was impossible to find it at night. The early navigators were flying almost blind. They were using methods that would have been familiar to a sea captain in the 1800s. The first was dead reckoning. You fly on a specific compass heading at a specific speed for a specific amount of time. But this assumed the air was perfectly still. The unseen winds over Europe, what the crews simply called weather, could blow a bomber dozens, even hundreds of miles off course without the crew ever knowing it. The other method was celestial navigation. Imagine trying to use a delicate sextant to shoot the stars, looking through a small, vibrating perspex dome while your aircraft is shaking violently, freezing cold, and being targeted by anti-aircraft fire from below.
The results were not just poor, they were a state secret, a national embarrassment. In August of 1941, the British government commissioned a quiet internal study led by a man named David Butt. The Butt Report, as it became known, was devastating. It analyzed thousands of photographs taken by the bombers themselves at the moment they dropped their payloads. The findings were stark. Of all the bombers that claimed to have hit their target, only 1 in 3 got within 5 miles of it. 5 miles! That's a target area of 75 square miles. And this was for all of occupied Europe. Over the industrial heartland of Germany, the Ruhr Valley, where the flock was thickest and the haze from the factories was worst, the number dropped to a staggering 1 in 10. The bombers, crews, and fuel were being sacrificed night after night for almost no material effect. They weren't hitting the factories. Most of the time, they weren't even hitting the right city. Bombs meant for industrial targets in the Ruhr were found scattered across quiet farmland, miles from anything of value. And this failure is where the German ridicule began. It wasn't just propaganda, it was rooted in fact. The head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, had famously boasted, "No enemy bomber can reach the Ruhr." When the bombs did fall, scattered and random, it only confirmed the German belief that the Allies were incompetent, clumsy. German civil defense manuals, the Luftschutz, which had been written with a tone of urgency, became almost complacent. Air raid warnings for a time were treated by the German public as a mere nuisance, a frustrating drill that pulled them out of bed for no reason. In Berlin, Hamburg, and Essen, citizens felt a sense of security. They were protected by their fighters, by their flock, and most of all, by their weather. They looked up at the solid gray overcast and saw a shield stronger than any steel. It's a part of the war many of us forget, the sheer, staggering failure of the early air campaign. If you remember hearing stories about this time, perhaps from your fathers or uncles, let us know in the comments. It's important to remember the impossible odds they faced and what they had to overcome. This sense of invulnerability only grew. When the United States entered the war, the 8th Air Force arrived in England, led by men like General Ira Aker. They were true believers in the American doctrine. They would not be cowed by the Luftwaffe. They would fly in daylight, in massive self-defending formations, and they would prove the bomber mafia right. They had a secret weapon the British lacked, the legendary, almost mythical Norden bomb sight. The Norden was a marvel of its time. It was a complex, analog computer of gears and gyroscopes. The bombardier would lie prone, look through its eyepiece, and feed it information: airspeed, altitude, wind drift. He would lock its crosshairs on the target, and the bomb sight would fly the plane for the final few moments of the run. It was so secret that crews were ordered to destroy it with a thermite grenade if they were shot down. The promise was that the Norden could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. But the Germans had a saying: "The Norden bomb sight is a wonderful instrument, but it cannot see through clouds." And the pickle barrel in Germany was almost always covered by clouds. 10/10 overcast was the norm. The fog of war was literal. The bombardier, after a harrowing 6-hour flight, would arrive at the target only to see a solid white floor below him. And even on the rare clear days, the German defenses were waiting. The flak, the anti-aircraft artillery, was ferocious. It threw up a wall of black, greasy smoke and tearing shrapnel. And the German fighters, the Messerschmitts and the Focke-Wulfs, pressed their attacks with suicidal bravery, flying directly into the bomber streams. The breaking point for the Americans came in the fall of 1943. The 8th Air Force launched 2 massive raids against the ball-bearing factories deep inside Germany, at Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The second raid, on October 14, 1943, became known as Black Thursday. The 8th Air Force lost 60, that's 60 B-29 flying fortresses. Hundreds more were damaged. Nearly 600 men were killed, wounded, or captured. It was a loss rate of over 20%. No force could survive that. The American precision daylight theory was dead in the water. The bombers were not getting through.
The Germans, for a moment, had won the air war over their homeland. The ridicule had turned into a grim, battlefield victory. Back in Britain, the situation was a crisis. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, under immense pressure, needed a victory. The British public, having endured the Blitz, demanded retaliation. The Americans were reeling. Something had to change. Sir Arthur Bomber Harris, the iron-willed head of RAF Bomber Command, was given a new, brutal directive. If they could not hit the factory, they would hit the city around the factory. The new target was not the war machine, but the war worker. The new doctrine was dehousing. This was area bombing, plain and simple. But even with this new cynical strategy, Harris faced the exact same problem that the Butt report had exposed. How do you find the city? How do you concentrate the bombs? 1,000 bombers dropping their loads over 75 square miles was just terror, not strategy. He needed them all to drop their bombs in the same square mile. To do that, his navigators needed a map they could read in the dark, through solid clouds. They needed a miracle. And in a quiet laboratory at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, or TRE, that miracle was already being born. The story of that miracle doesn't start with a bomber. It starts with the Battle of Britain. The British had held off the Luftwaffe thanks to their chain-home radar system, but that was a massive ground-based system with 300-foot towers. It was defensive. The challenge was to make a radar set small enough and light enough to fit inside an airplane. Early airborne radars existed, but they had a problem. They used long wavelengths, which meant their antennas had to be huge, great bristling things that looked like bed springs strapped to the wings. They were clumsy, created immense drag, and their picture of the world was broad and fuzzy. They could find a coastline, maybe, but not a city. The breakthrough came from a moment of desperation. In August of 1940, with Britain standing alone, Sir Henry Tizard led a secret mission to the still neutral United States. They brought with them a locked box containing what they called Britain's crown jewels. It was a portfolio of their most advanced, secret technologies, which they offered to the Americans in exchange for manufacturing help. And inside that box was a device that would change the world. It was called the cavity magnetron. To understand its importance, you have to understand the problem. To get a sharp, clear radar picture from a small antenna, you needed to generate immense power using a very short wavelength in the microwave spectrum. Nobody knew how to do this. The best efforts in the world were producing mere watts of power. The cavity magnetron, developed by two scientists, John Randall and Harry Boot at the University of Birmingham, solved it. It was a simple, palm-sized disc of copper. Imagine a bicycle whistle. You blow air across a small hole, and it creates a high-pitched sound. The magnetron blew a stream of electrons past a series of small copper cavities, creating an incredibly powerful sound in the microwave spectrum. It generated kilowatts of power, not watts. It was 1,000 times more powerful than anything the Americans or the Germans had. The single small device meant that the Allies were now years ahead of the Axis in radar technology. It meant you could build a small, lightweight radar set with a compact dish that could fit in the belly of a bomber and send out a signal powerful and sharp enough to paint a detailed picture of the world below. At the British TRE, scientists, including a young man named Bernard Lovell, who would later become famous for the Jodrell Bank radio telescope, realized this new 10-centimeter radar could be used for two critical tasks. First, it could hunt U-boats. A radar-equipped plane could see the conning tower of a submarine on the surface of the black, nighttime Atlantic. This was air-to-surface vessel, or ASV radar, and it would be instrumental in winning the Battle of the Atlantic. But Lovell and his team saw another, more revolutionary use. If it could see a ship on the water, what could it see on land? They pointed the radar down. The results were astounding. They had created the invisible map.
They called the new system H2S. The official story is that it stood for Home Sweet Home, a guiding beacon for the bombers. A more likely and more human story is that when the idea was first proposed, one frustrated scientist, tired of the slow pace of development, declared the whole project stinks, a reference to the foul-smelling gas hydrogen sulfide. The name stuck. They mounted a rotating dish, a scanner, in a plastic bubble on the belly of a bomber. As the dish spun, it sent out a continuous stream of microwave pulses. The way those pulses were turned painted a picture on a cathode ray tube screen right in front of the navigator. It was a masterpiece of physics. Water, being flat, reflected the radar pulses away from the plane, so rivers, lakes, and oceans appeared as black, dark shapes. Land, being rougher, scattered some pulses back, appearing as a dim gray glow. But cities full of hard, angular buildings, factories, and stone reflected the pulses directly back at the plane. On the screen, a city glowed like a bright, ghostly nebula. For the first time, a navigator could look at a screen and see the world as God saw it. He could see the black ribbon of the Rhine River. He could see the dark shape of the Zuiderzee in Holland. He could see the bright, unmistakable blob of Berlin. It didn't matter if it was pitch black. It didn't matter if it was 10/10ths cloud cover. They could see. But this incredible power created an agonizing moral hazard. Churchill's chief science advisor, Professor Lindemann, argued fiercely against its use. He was terrified of what would happen if a bomber carrying this secret was shot down over Germany. If the Germans captured a cavity magnetron, they would understand it. They would reverse engineer it. They would learn in an instant what had taken the Allies years to develop. They could use it to improve their own night fighter radar, making the skies even deadlier for the RAF. They could use it to find the Allied convoys. The risk was immense. The debate raged. Was it worth sacrificing this long-term strategic advantage for a short-term bombing victory? In the end, the pressure for results from Bomber Harris won out. The decision was made to risk it. But they added a precaution. Every H2S set was fitted with a small explosive destructor charge. Crews were given strict orders. If you are going down, you must trigger the destructor to destroy the radar and its precious magnetron. The precaution failed almost immediately. On its second operational mission in February 1933, a bomber carrying an H2S set was shot down near Rotterdam. The destructor charge failed to detonate. They had it. They were astonished by what they found. They nicknamed it the Rotterdam Garret, the Rotterdam device, and their scientists immediately set to work. The technological race was on. But for the Germans, it was too late. The secret was out, and Bomber Harris was ready to use it. This leads us to the moment the ridicule stopped for good. The night of July 24th, 1943. Operation Gomorrah. The target? Hamburg. Hamburg was Germany's second-largest city, a major port, and full of industry. It was also, from a navigator's perspective, a perfect H2S target. It sat on the wide black ribbon of the Elbe River, a perfect navigational marker. For the first time, H2S was not just an experiment, it was the primary tool for an entire campaign. The elite Pathfinder crews went in first. They flew through the dark and the clouds, their navigators' faces lit by the ghostly green glow of the radar screen. They saw the Elbe. They saw the bright glow of the city. They lined up their crosshairs and dropped their markers, not scattered bombs, but cascades of bright, colored flares right onto the heart of the target areas. Then, the main force of over 700 bombers followed. They didn't need to find the city. They just had to bomb the Christmas tree, the bright flares burning on the ground below. The bombing was more concentrated than anything the world had ever seen, and it was followed by a second, and a third, and a fourth night of raids. The city's defenses were blinded by a new British countermeasure called window, just strips of tinfoil dropped from the planes, which completely confused the German ground radar. The combination of H2S for accuracy and window for defense was unstoppable. On the night of July 27th, the bombing was so accurate and so relentless that it triggered something new, something horrifying – a firestorm. The thousands of individual fires ignited by the incendiary bombs all merged into one massive conflagration. It created a 1,000-foot tall vortex of superheated air, a literal tornado of fire. The winds at its center reached 150 miles per hour. The temperatures hit 800 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt glass and asphalt. It was so powerful that it sucked the oxygen from the air, suffocating people in their basement shelters. In 1 week, 40,000 German civilians were killed.
The effect on the German leadership was one of pure terror. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, flew over the charred, smoking ruins. He wrote later that he told Hitler directly, if the Allies could repeat this on 6 more major German cities, the war would be over. The ridicule was gone. The laughter of Goering and the complacency of the civil defense had been incinerated in the Hamburg firestorm. The invisible map, the H2X, had given the Allies a weapon of terrible, decisive power. This leap in technology is staggering. It's a reminder that war is often won by scientists in laboratories as much as by soldiers on the front lines. If this kind of history, the game-changer moments, fascinates you, consider subscribing. We cover these technological turning points every week because they are so crucial to understanding how our world was shaped. Now, as the Germans frantically tried to copy the Rotterdam device, the Americans were watching. They saw the power of H2S and they wanted their own. But they weren't interested in the British 10-centimeter version. Their own scientists, working at the legendary MIT Radiation Lab, had already taken the next step. They had perfected a 3-centimeter magnetron operating in what was called the X-band. This is a crucial detail. A shorter wavelength allows for a smaller antenna to produce a much sharper radar image. The resolution was finer. It could pick out smaller details. Where H2S showed a city as a glowing blob, the new American radar could start to define the blocks within the city. They called this new system H2X. The crews naturally gave it a nickname. They called it Mickey. Some say this was because the scanner and its associated box looked like Mickey Mouse. Others said it was because, compared to the complexities of the Norden bomb site, it was a Mickey Mouse or simplified system. At first, they didn't trust it. Soon, it would become the only thing they did trust. This new, perfected radar was destined for an equally new and perfected airplane, the B-29 Superfortress. We have to understand, the B-29 was not just a bigger B-17. It was a leap in technology as profound as the Magnetron itself. It was the first fully pressurized production bomber, meaning the crew could fly in relative comfort at 30,000 feet or more, high above the worst of the flak and most of the enemy fighters. Its guns weren't manned by hand. They were controlled by remote, computerized turrets. And it had an incredible hemispheric range. This plane was not built for the short hops over the English Channel. It was designed from the ground up for one theater and one theater only, the Pacific. The war in the Pacific was a war of water, a war of distance. There were no friendly airfields in France to fly from. The journey from the newly captured airfields in the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, to the Japanese home islands was a grueling 1,500-mile flight, one way. Over 1,500 miles of empty black ocean. For this kind of navigation, dead reckoning was suicide. Celestial navigation was still the primary tool, but H2X gave them an assurance they'd never had. They could fly for hours over black water, and then, exactly when the navigator predicted it, the coast of Japan would appear on his screen, a glowing line in the dark. The man given command of the 1st B-29 wing, the 21st Bomber Command, was General Haywood Hansell. Hansell was a bomber mafia true believer. He was an architect of the original American precision bombing doctrine. He was not interested in Bomber Harris's area bombing. He was going to prove the theory right. His plan was simple: high altitude, 30,000 feet, daylight for visual bombing, and precision,
using the Norden bomb sight to hit Japanese aircraft factories, just as they had tried to hit the German factories. The H2X radar in his plan was just a navigational aid. It was there to get them to the coast, at which point the bombardier would take over with the pickle-barrel Norden. From October 1944 to January 1945, Hansel threw his new B-29s against Japan, and it was a complete, staggering disaster. The planes were hitting the targets, the crews were performing bravely, but the bombs were not. They were missing, and not by feet, but by miles. Hansel and his crews were baffled. They had the best planes, the best bomb sights, the best radar. What was going wrong?
They had discovered an enemy that no one in 1940 had ever predicted, an invisible, unstoppable force of nature, the jet stream. At 30,000 feet over Japan, the B-29s were encountering winds of 150, 200, sometimes 250 miles per hour. It was a literal river of air, moving at the speed of a fighter plane. The Norden bomb sight, that delicate mechanical computer, simply could not cope. It wasn't designed for this. The bombardier would release the bombs, and they would simply be blown sideways, scattering harmlessly across the countryside. Furthermore, the B-29s were burning catastrophic amounts of fuel just to fight this headwind, reducing their range and forcing many to ditch in the ocean on the way home. The accuracy was, at times, worse than the old B-17s over Germany. Back in Washington, the mood was poisonous. The B-29 was the single most expensive weapons program of the entire war. It cost more than the Manhattan Project, which was building the atomic bomb. Billions of dollars had been spent on this silver bullet, and it was failing. General Hap Arnold, the head of the entire Army Air Forces, was under such intense pressure that he suffered a massive heart attack. From his hospital bed, he knew he had to make a change. He had to fire his protege, Hansel, the precision idealist, and he had to bring in a man who was the complete opposite. A man who had seen the effects of firebombing in Europe, a man who was pragmatic, ruthless, and obsessed with only one thing: results. He brought in Major General Curtis LeMay. LeMay arrived in the Marianas in January 1945. He looked at Hansel's charts. He saw the failure. He saw the high-altitude winds. He saw the poor accuracy. And he looked at his intelligence reports on Japanese cities. He saw that, unlike German cities of stone and brick, Japanese industry was not concentrated in massive concrete factories. It was spread out in thousands of small shadow factories, little workshops operating out of homes in densely packed neighborhoods of wood and paper. He made a decision that would change the course of the war and the history of the 20th century. He declared that the high-altitude, daylight precision campaign was over. He was going to completely change the tactics. His B-29s would attack at night. They would attack low, at 5,000 to 7,000 feet, well below the vicious jet stream. And they would not drop a single high-explosive bomb. They would carry nothing but incendiaries, firebombs. His crews were horrified. They thought he was insane. Go in low, at night, over Tokyo, one of the most heavily defended cities on Earth? They would be sitting ducks for the anti-aircraft guns. And LeMay wasn't done. He made another, even more terrifying calculation. At low altitude, they wouldn't need to fight the jet stream. They would burn less fuel. They wouldn't need to climb for hours. And if they were flying alone, at night, maybe they wouldn't need their guns. He ordered the B-29s stripped. The remote-controlled turrets, the 50-caliber machine guns, the thousands of rounds of ammunition, all of it was to be left behind on Tinian. In its place, they would load more incendiaries. They would be faster, but they would be utterly defenseless. Their only shield was the darkness, and their only guide, their only map to the target, would be the glowing green screen of the H2X Mickey radar. The target was Tokyo, March 1945, a sprawling city of over 6 million people. LeMay and his planners didn't target the Imperial Palace or the centers of government. They targeted a 12-square-mile rectangle in the northeast of the city.
It was one of the most densely populated places on the planet, a vast area of wooden homes and small cottage industries. It was, as one planner grimly noted, the most flammable city in the world. The night was March 9, 1945. The mission was codenamed Operation Meetinghouse. Over 300 B-29s, flying not in formation, but as a long, trailing stream, took off from the Marianas. They flew in low over the Black Ocean. The lead planes, the Pathfinders, approached the coast of Japan. Their navigators weren't looking out the window. They were huddled over their radar scopes. They saw it clearly, the dark, unmistakable shape of Tokyo Bay. They saw the black lines of the Sumida and Arakawa rivers, and they saw the bright, glowing mass of the city blocks. They lined up their crosshairs on the designated rectangle. At 12:08 a.m. on March 10, 1945, the first bombs fell. They weren't high explosives, they were incendiaries, dropped in a massive burning X across the target zone. For the next 3 hours, the main force of B-29s followed. They didn't need radar, they didn't need maps. All they had to do was fly towards the fire, which was visible from 150 miles away. They were dropping a new kind of weapon, the M69 incendiary. These were not large bombs. They were small, 6-pound bomblets packed into 500-pound clusters. When the cluster burst, it scattered these small jelly gas canisters, which punched through the flimsy tile roofs and ignited, spreading a napalm-like gel that could not be extinguished with water.